He held the absolute power of life and death over a $40 billion empire. But at 90 years old, Sumner Redstone was nothing more than a drooling, sex-obsessed deviant being bled dry to the bone. His paralyzing fear of death mutated him into a pathological pervert, funneling tens of millions of dollars to buy women young enough to be his granddaughters, forcing them to procure escorts to service him even after he had become completely impotent. The fire-breathing titan was ultimately reduced to a mutilated invalid, tethered to a feeding tube, stripped of his voice, and weeping for attention through a crude iPad. This is the disgusting secret life of America's most powerful media mogul, a tyrant drowning in the humiliating, grotesque garbage of his own making. The foundation of his pathological need for control was forged long before the corporate boardrooms of Hollywood. Born Sumner Rothstein in 1923, he changed his surname to Redstone at 17, a calculated rebranding to signal an unyielding nature. His intellect, sharpened by cracking Japanese military codes during the Second World War, hardwired him to view human communication as a rigid system of vulnerabilities to be exploited. Returning to his family's drive-in theater business in Boston, he recognized that whoever controlled the physical bottleneck of distribution held absolute power over the Hollywood studios. He operated purely as an aggregator of leverage, viewing every rival and eventually every family member as a code to be broken. Up to this point, his ambition appeared as a standard, albeit aggressive, American success story. Then in 1979, the defining crucible of his life occurred, an event that forged his fatal weakness into an unbreakable psychological iron. He was staying at the Copley Plaza Hotel in Boston when a massive fire broke out. Trapped in his third-floor room as flames consumed the hallway, Redstone opened the window. The heat was so intense it blistered the paint on the wall. LS. With his back literally to the fire, he climbed out of the window and hung by his fingertips from the exterior ledge. The flames licked out of the window, severely burning his right hand and arm. The pain was beyond human comprehension, tearing through his flesh, leaving third-degree burns over 45% of his body. He hung there, his flesh fusing to the stone ledge, until he was finally rescued. Doctors told him he would likely never walk again, that the sheer trauma to his system would leave him permanently incapacitated. They did not understand the sheer terrifying magnitude of his willpower. He endured agonizing skin grafts, forced himself through excruciating physical therapy, and walked out of the hospital. He survived a situation where biological death was a near certainty. Rather than instilling gratitude, this miraculous survival mutated into profound arrogance. The fire convinced Sumner Redstone that his sheer force of will could conquer biology itself. He had out-negotiated death. This physical manifestation of his psychological state, a scarred, burning hand gripping a ledge, became the central myth of his existence. He genuinely began to believe that the rules of human mortality simply did not apply to him. Armed with this invincible mindset, Redstone spent the next 3 decades ruthlessly consolidating absolute power over the American media landscape, acquiring giants like Viacom, Paramount, and CBS. His corporate governance was built entirely on a foundation of paranoia and absolute monarchy. Inside the boardroom, he was a dictator who ruled by fear, demanding total fealty and destroying any executive who exhibited independent thought. But his fatal weakness, his hamartia, was his absolute refusal to name a successor. Whenever asked about a succession plan, he would bark his terrifying mantra, I have no intention of ever retiring or of dying. He viewed the concept of a successor as a biological threat, an admission that he would one day cease to exist. This pathological denial extended deeply into his family life. He had a daughter, Sherry Redstone, who was highly competent and the natural heir. But to him, an heir was a replacement, and a replacement was an enemy. He publicly humiliated Sherry, repeatedly floating the idea of selling the entire empire rather than handing it over to her. He isolated her, effectively making his own biological decay the single point of failure for a $40 billion enterprise. As he moved through his late 70s and into his 80s, the physical reality of his cellular decay began to crash violently against his corporate myth of invincibility. This is the era where the public facade became overtly grotesque. Redstone began dyeing his hair an unnatural harsh shade of auburn. His voice, permanently damaged and reduced to a raspy, guttural whisper by the hotel fire decades earlier, became harder to understand. Yet, he continued to lead quarterly earnings calls, aggressively barking at financial analysts, his strained voice projecting a desperate demand for dominance over the telephone lines. He began giving interviews where his statements detached completely from reality. During a famous appearance on Larry King Live and repeatedly to financial journalists, he declared his absolute refusal to die. He stated on the record that he was on a special diet, that he exercised vigorously, and that his biological clock operated differently than the rest of humanity. This was not a public relations spin. He was demanding that Wall Street value his company based on the premise of his literal immortality. This relentless forcing of reality to bend to his will completely destroyed his relationship with his own bloodline. The rift with his daughter, Sherry Redstone, reached a catastrophic public breaking point. Sherry had spent years working within National Amusements, attempting to modernize the theater chain and position herself as a competent, natural successor. But our Edstone's psychological weakness, his inability to view an heir as anything other than a grim reaper waiting to steal his power, drove him to humiliate her on a global stage. In 2007, he sent a searing, highly publicized letter to Forbes magazine. He did not simply outline a business disagreement. He attempted to surgically destroy his daughter's professional reputation. He publicly stated that Sherry had made little to no contribution to the success of the company, that she was attempting to usurp his authority, and that he would rather sell his entire empire than allow her to control it. He was cannibalizing his own family to protect his throne. He used the media to broadcast his deep, visceral distrust of his own flesh and blood. He had built a fortress of legal documents, voting shares, and compliant lawyers. He had successfully alienated his daughter, purged every visionary executive capable of pushing back against his worst impulses, and surrounded himself entirely with highly compensated yes-men who relied on his continued reign for their own wealth. Heading into the late 2000s, his heavily fortified ecosystem appeared financially functional. The stock price, driven by the legacy assets of CBS and MTV, held up the illusion of his absolute control. Why yet the biology he so arrogantly dismissed was about to breach the walls of his Beverly Hills mansion. By systematically eliminating his family and competent allies, he created a vacuum of genuine loyalty, leaving him entirely exposed to opportunistic predators who viewed his isolation not as a tragedy, but as the ultimate financial extraction event. The corporate executions of the 2000s successfully insulated Sumner Redstone from any internal intellectual challenge, but they provided absolutely no defense against the relentless arithmetic of human biology. As he crossed the threshold of his 85th birthday, the physical reality of his cellular decay began to aggressively breach the walls of his careful, light-constructed mythology. The man who had publicly declared his own immortality was now engaged in a desperate, deeply secretive, and phenomenally expensive daily war against his own failing anatomy. The issue was not merely that an elderly man was experiencing a decline in health. That is a universal human condition. The issue was the grotesque lengths to which he utilized the resources of a publicly traded empire to mandate a collective delusion that this decline was not happening. The epicenter of this delusion was his residence in the ultra-exclusive, heavily guarded enclave of Beverly Park in Los Angeles. This was not a home in the traditional sense. It was rapidly being retrofitted into a state-of-the-art, covert medical facility. His absolute terror of appearing vulnerable dictated the very architecture of his daily life. The scars from the Boston fire, which he had carried for decades, began to severely restrict his mobility. His gait, once aggressive and intimidating, devolved into a fragile, precarious shuffle. The damage to his vocal cords, a lifelong rasp, deteriorated further. He struggled to articulate words, his speech becoming a thick, wet slur that required intense concentration to decipher. Instead of stepping back and appointing a capable successor to manage the $40 billion portfolio of Viacom and CBS, Redstone weaponized his legal department to enforce a perimeter of silence. The primary tool of this era was not the corporate merger, but the non-disclosure agreement. A draconian web of NDAs was cast over every individual who crossed the threshold of the Beverly Park compound. It was not just the specialized medical staff who were legally bound to silence. It was the drivers, the private chefs, the housekeepers, and the security personnel. Anyone who witnessed the chairman of the board struggling to chew his food or needing physical assistance to simply stand up from a chair was threatened with catastrophic financial ruin if they ever saw a poke of it. He was utilizing the immense legal leverage of his corporate wealth to criminalize the truth of his own mortality. The public facade required an exhausting, almost theatrical level of daily maintenance. He continued to dye his hair that harsh, unconvincing shade of auburn, a visual desperately clinging to a bygone era. His suits were meticulously tailored to hide the accelerating loss of muscle mass. When he was required to make public appearances or attend corporate events, the logistics resembled a covert military operation. Aides would map out the exact number of steps from the armored car to the chair. They ensured the lighting was strictly controlled to wash out the deep, hollowed lines of his face. He was propped up, positioned, and heavily managed, functioning less as a chief executive and more as an animatronic mascot of his own legacy. The complicity in this charade extended far beyond his immediate staff. It infected the very top tiers of the corporate structure he had built. Philippe Dumont, the loyalist lawyer Redstone had installed as CEO of Viacom, and Les Moonves, the powerful head of CBS, became active participants in the cover-up. During quarterly earnings calls with Wall Street analysts, a truly bizarre ritual unfolded. Redstone would dial in, his voice frequently a barely intelligible guttural noise. When analysts asked complex financial questions, Redstone would attempt to answer, often producing only a string of slurred syllables. The highly paid executives would then seamlessly step in, translating the chairman's noises into coherent corporate strategy. They would say, "What Sumner means is," and proceed to deliver the prepared talking points. This was a profound corruption of corporate governance. Institutional investors, managing billions of dollars of public pension funds, were listening to a man who clearly lacked the physical capacity to participate in a basic conversation. Yet they collectively agreed to ignore the evidence. See of their own ears. As long as the dividends were paid and the stock price remained stable, Wall Street was perfectly willing to humor the emperor's delusion. They traded their fiduciary responsibility for the path of least resistance, enabling a system where a severely compromised non-agenarian retained absolute voting control over the information diet of the American public. Behind the heavily fortified gates of Beverly Park, as the physical capacity to exercise power faded, a new, far more dangerous psychological substitution began to take root. Power, for Redstone, had always been synonymous with dominance, and a core component of his perceived dominance was his absolute, unyielding belief in his own extreme masculinity. He had spent his life using his wealth to acquire companies and crush rivals. Now, facing an increasingly frail reflection in the mirror, he began using that same wealth to purchase the visual appearance of sexual vitality. The standard corporate succession crisis soon dissolved into a deeply uncomfortable psychological tragedy. Court documents and sworn testimonies from this period reveal a man who, despite reportedly losing all actual physiological capability for sexual intercourse, became obsessed with maintaining a harem. He did not seek companionship or intellectual partnership. He sought living props to populate the theater of his denial. He began utilizing high-end matchmaking services and personal fixers to stream a constant rotation of young, attractive women into the mansion. His wealth purchased an audience, a transactional simulation of human connection. He routinely handed out envelopes containing tens of thousands of dollars in cash simply for these women to sit near him, to flatter him, and to engage in acts of physical affection that he could direct but no longer fully participate in. He demanded that they watch him eat, that they laugh at his slurred jokes, and that they constantly reinforce the illusion that he was still a Vaioidi, Ibrant, highly desired titan. It was a transactional simulation of human connection, completely devoid of actual humanity. He was attempting to bribe biology. He believed that if he surrounded himself with enough youth purchased at a high enough premium, he could somehow absorb their vitality through sheer financial proximity. The tragedy of this era is sharply defined by who was explicitly excluded from this purchased reality. While Redstone was handing out six-figure cash gifts to strangers who had known him for less than a week, he was simultaneously escalating his legal and emotional war against his own daughter, Sherry Redstone, who recognized the alarming deterioration of her father's condition and the predatory nature of the environment he was creating, repeatedly attempted to intervene. She tried to penetrate the fortress of NDAs and sycophantic executives to establish a standard of legitimate medical and familial care. Her attempts were met with vicious retaliation. Redstone, his paranoia fueled by the isolation and his profound terror of being perceived as weak, viewed his daughter's concern not as love, but as an attempted coup. He instructed his lawyers to draft documents further distancing her from the corporate trusts. He banned her from entering the Beverly Park compound without explicit prior written permission. He chose the comforting purchased lies of hired companions over the harsh necessary truths of his own flesh and blood. He locked the gates to keep reality out. Up to this point, the situation, while deeply dysfunctional and ethically bankrupt, was still operating under a grim sort of equilibrium. He was bleeding cash to his rotating cast of companions, but his billion-dollar fortune could easily absorb the cost. The corporate executives were covering for him, and Wall Street was looking the other way. He had built a perfectly sealed ecosystem where his every delusion was instantly validated by a payroll of enablers. But the fatal flaw in T, his architecture of control, was that it relied entirely on the transactional loyalty of mercenaries. He had systematically eliminated anyone who cared about Sumner Redstone, the human being, leaving only those who cared about Sumner Redstone, the bank account. This lifelong practice of reducing human relationships to strategic leverage had successfully created a vacuum. He had turned his heavily guarded mansion into a warm, incredibly lucrative incubator, perfectly designed to attract a highly specific type of apex predator. The random rotation of paid models and aspiring actresses was about to end. The ecosystem was ripe for consolidation. Two women, recognizing the extraordinary vulnerability hidden beneath the billions, were preparing to cross the threshold, intent on monopolizing the ultimate prize. The ecosystem of paid companionship that Sumner Redstone had constructed within his Beverly Park compound was inherently unstable. It was a chaotic rotation of transactional relationships, reliant on fixers and matchmakers to maintain a constant supply of willing participants. However, an environment defined by extreme wealth and profound emotional isolation abhors a vacuum. Into this carefully sealed, heavily guarded void stepped two women who would systematically consolidate control over the billionaire's life, his finances, and his medical autonomy. Their names were Manuela Herzer and Sydney Holland. They did not arrive as a team, nor did they initially present themselves as corporate conquerors. They arrived under the guise of care, companionship, and romantic partnership, capitalizing perfectly on Redstone's fatal weakness, his desperate, pathological need to be surrounded by individuals who validated his illusion of vitality while asking absolutely no difficult questions about his mortality. Manuela Herzer was a longtime acquaintance, a glamorous fixture in Los Angeles social circles, who had known Redstone since the late 1990s. Sydney Holland was reduced to him years later, reportedly through a high-end matchmaking service. By the early 2000s, both women had firmly embedded themselves in the daily architecture of his life. They eventually moved into the sprawling Beverly Park estate, occupying separate wings, forming a bizarre, highly lucrative domestic triangle with the chairman of Viacom and CBS. The billionaire, who had spent his career ruthlessly eliminating competent executives to ensure his absolute supremacy, had now voluntarily surrendered the intimate perimeter of his daily existence to two women with no corporate experience, no medical training, and an escalating appetite for his liquid assets. Up to this point, the arrangement, while deeply unconventional, was legally framed as consensual. Redstone was an adult, functioning as the head of a massive public corporation, fully capable of spending his personal fortune however he saw fit. But in 2014, the biological reality he had spent a lifetime denying finally initiated a catastrophic, irreversible collapse. He suffered from severe aspiration, a condition where the muscles governing the throat fail, allowing food and liquid to slip past the vocal cords and directly into the lungs. It is a terrifying, physically agonizing experience, frequently leading to lethal bouts of pneumonia. The man who had famously declared to Wall Street that he was on a special life-extending diet could no longer perform the basic human function of swallowing a glass of water. The medical intervention required to save his life permanently destroyed the illusion of his physical autonomy. Doctors surgically inserted a percutaneous endoscopic gastrostomy tube, commonly known as a PG tube, directly through his abdominal wall and into his stomach. A highly sophisticated mechanized pump was installed next to his bed to deliver a carefully calibrated liquid nutrient formula. Because he could not swallow his own saliva, a specialized suction machine had to be operated constantly by a rotation of private nurses to prevent him from drowning in his own fluids. The chairman of Paramount Pictures, the man who dictated the visual culture of the globe, was now tethered to a wall, his survival dependent entirely on a plastic tube and a motorized pump. This physical collapse triggered a secondary, far more devastating loss: the complete eradication of his voice. The fire at the Copley Plaza Hotel in 1979 had left his vocal cords severely scarred, rendering his speech a raspy, intimidating whisper. But following the severe respiratory issues and the loss of muscle control in 2014, that whisper degraded into unintelligible grunts and eventually total silence. For a man whose entire methodology of exercising power relied on screaming at executives over the telephone and dominating boardrooms, with his relentless vocal presence, the loss of speech was not just a medical symptom. It was the total annihilation of his primary weapon. He was trapped inside a failing body, fully aware of his surroundings, but entirely stripped of the ability to project his will into the physical world. And this is exactly where the situation descends into the grotesque. To solve the problem of his total lack of communication, a device was introduced that would become the central haunting symbol of his final years. It was an iPad, heavily modified and stripped of all standard applications. The screen displayed no keyboard, no predictive text, no ability to type out complex thoughts or corporate strategies. It featured only 3 massive, brightly colored digital buttons: yes, no, and a highly vulgar expletive functioning as an expression of anger or dismissal. The profound horror of the 3-button iPad lay not in the technology, but in the complete inversion of power. If a man can only answer yes or no, he has completely lost the ability to initiate a conversation. He cannot ask for a specific doctor. He cannot request a review of his financial portfolios. He cannot demand to see his grandchildren. He can only react to the stimuli presented to him. Therefore, absolute power transfers instantly from the man pressing the buttons to the person asking the questions. The individual who controls the phrasing of the inquiry controls the reality of the response. If an aide asks, "Do you want to authorize this $10 million wire transfer to Sydney?" and guides his trembling finger to the yes button, it constitutes legal consent. The architect of hostile takeovers had been reduced to a binary code, completely at the mercy of the programmers. With Redstone physically immobilized and rendered mute, Holland and Hertzer allegedly initiated a systematic purge of the Beverly Park compound. Court documents and explosive testimonies from former nursing staff would later detail a terrifying environment of intimidation and absolute isolation. The nurses, highly trained medical professionals who were legally mandated to report elder abuse, found themselves trapped in a hostile perimeter. If a nurse raised concerns about the dosage of medications or questioned the sheer volume of cash being extracted from the estate, they were swiftly terminated. The women effectively became the ultimate gatekeepers, terminating the employment of any staff member who exhibited loyalty to Redstone's health rather than obedience to their directives. The mechanism of control extended deeply into his medical chart. According to subsequent legal filings, The women heavily manipulated his access to psychiatric medication, specifically the powerful sedative lorazepam, sold under the brand name Ativan. When Redstone became agitated, perhaps frustrated by his inability to speak, or perhaps aware of the sheer scale of the financial extraction occurring around him, he was not offered psychological support or familial comfort. He was reportedly administered heavy doses of sedatives, chemically subjugating his remaining willpower, rendering him docile and compliant. T. The man who prided himself on needing only 3 hours of sleep a night, who operated purely on adrenaline and conflict, was now frequently observed slumped in his chair, heavily medicated, staring blankly at a television screen, broadcasting the networks he technically still owned. The most brutal application of this newly consolidated power was directed outward, aimed squarely at the final remaining threat to their absolute dominion, Redstone's family. The physical gates of the Beverly Park mansion were weaponized against his own bloodline. Sherry Redstone, who had spent years enduring her father's public humiliations, but remained deeply concerned about his physical survival, found herself entirely locked out. Security guards paid from Redstone's accounts but taking orders directly from Holland and Hertzer were instructed to turn Sherry away at the gate. When his grandchildren attempted to visit, they were blocked. The women claimed they were merely enforcing the chairman's wishes, acting as his loyal protectors against a family that only cared about his money. They utilized the 3-button iPad as their ultimate defense. They could ask him, "Do you want to see Sherry?" and register his no as absolute legal justification for the banishment. By the end of 2014, the coup was complete. The physical isolation was absolute. The chemical subjugation was allegedly routine. The financial extraction was accelerating at a staggering pace, with tens of millions of dollars in cash, real estate, and designer clothing flowing out of his accounts and into the hands of his 2 gatekeepers. Viacom and CBS continued to operate under the bizarre fiction that their chairman was actively engaged in strategy, while inside the compound, he was a silent prisoner requiring a machine to clear the saliva from his throat. He had built a $40 billion empire designed to protect him from the world, and in doing so, he had successfully locked himself inside a vault with his captors, and the very mechanism he had spent his life perfecting, the ruthless elimination of any independent authority that could challenge his rule, was about to be utilized to execute a stunning legal strike against his own daughter, a move designed to permanently sever his final tie to reality and hand the keys of the kingdom directly to the women who controlled the iPad. The extraction of wealth from Sumner Redstone's accounts during 2014 and 2015 was staggering in its volume, yet it remained a fundamentally simple operation. Writing checks for millions of dollars to paid companions while ethically bankrupt is a standard mechanical function of extreme wealth. The true pivot of this narrative, the midpoint where the situation violently transitions from passive financial exploitation to the total legal hijacking of a human being, occurs when the target is no longer his bank account, but his legal personhood. The architects of this domestic coup recognized that cash transfers could eventually be audited or challenged by the corporate trusts. To secure permanent dominion, they needed to acquire the one asset far more valuable than Viacom stock, the legal right to dictate his physical existence. They needed a signature on an advance healthcare directive. An advance healthcare directive is the absolute bedrock of biological autonomy. It designates the individual who holds the legal authority to make life or death decisions when the principal is incapacitated. It dictates who controls the medical staff, who determines the administration of narcotics, who manages the access to the patient, and ultimately, who possesses the legal right to terminate life support. For years, Redstone's designated healthcare proxy had been his daughter, Sherry Redstone. Despite his public campaigns to humiliate her professionally, he had retained a baseline instinct for survival, recognizing that a blood relative was the only logical choice to guard his physical vulnerability. To complete the takeover of the Beverly Park compound, Manuela Herzer and Sidney Holland had to sever this final vital tether to reality. They had to convince a deeply paranoid, isolated man to hand the kill switch of his life over to the women he paid to flatter him. The execution of this legal strike required a highly specific psychological warfare campaign. According to explosive lawsuits and sworn testimony later filed by the Redstone family and former nursing staff, Herzer and Holland did not simply ask for the proxy. They weaponized Redstone's singular fatal weakness against him. His hamartia was his absolute consuming terror of weakness and his pathological refusal to accept his own mortality. The women allegedly initiated a systematic campaign of fear, feeding the silent, bedridden billionaire a constant diet of manufactured paranoia. They reportedly told him repeatedly that Sherry Redstone's ultimate goal was to declare him mentally incompetent. They whispered that his daughter intended to drag him out of his heavily fortified mansion, strip him of his remaining dignity, and lock him away in a clinical nursing facility. This specific narrative was perfectly engineered to trigger his deepest traumas. The man who had survived the Copley Plaza hotel fire by hanging from a ledge, refusing to surrender to physical death, was now being told that his own flesh and blood intended to institutionalize him. He was completely cut off from independent verification. The security guards blocked Sherry from visiting. The phone lines were monitored. His entire stream of information was curated by the two women occupying his house. His stark physical reality during this period, a man requiring a machine to suction the saliva from his failing throat, heavily medicated on Ativan, staring blankly at the walls, created the perfect environment for this gaslighting to take root. He was terrified, and the people generating the terror were presenting themselves as his only protectors. In mid-2015, the paperwork was drafted. The legal mechanics of what happened next represent one of the most grotesque contradictions in modern American corporate history. Sumner Redstone, a man who communicated primarily through grunts, whose vocabulary was allegedly reduced to the 3 buttons on his specialized iPad, was presented with highly complex legal documents restructuring his estate and his healthcare proxy. The law requires a notary public to verify that a signatory is of sound mind, acting under their own free will and fully comprehending the nature of the document they are executing. Court records would later scrutinize the surreal theater of these signings. Lawyers and notaries paid from the Redstone estate would enter the sterile bedroom. They would present the documents to a man connected to a feeding tube. Redstone would allegedly produce a guttural noise or point a trembling finger. The paid professionals in the room would then legally interpret this severe physical limitation as explicit, coherent consent. They verified the signature of a man who could barely hold a pen, legally validating the transfer of absolute medical authority from his daughter to Manuela Herzer. The successful execution of this healthcare directive officially transformed the former mastermind of Hollywood into a legally subjugated puppet. The power dynamic inverted completely. Hertzer, a woman with no medical background, no corporate fiduciary duty, and no biological tie to the patient, now held the absolute legal right to dictate the survival of the chairman of Viacom. She controlled the dosage of his sedatives. She controlled the hiring and firing of the specialized nurses who kept him from drowning in his own fluids. She held the legal authority to permanently bar his family from the property, not as a request, but as a binding medical mandate. The gap between this grim clinical subjugation in Beverly Hills and the public posturing in New York reached a level of staggering absurdity. At the exact moment Redstone was allegedly being manipulated into signing away his human rights via an iPad, Viacom CEO Philippe Doman was actively defending the chairman's mental acuity to the global financial markets. Doman, fighting to protect his own lucrative position, which relied entirely on Redstone remaining nominally in charge, assured Wall Street analysts and angry shareholders that the 92-year-old billionaire was fully engaged. Doman publicly claimed he had extensive, detailed conversations with Redstone about international media strategy and digital streaming platforms. This was the corporate enabling of elder abuse on a multi-billion-dollar scale. The board of directors, men and women responsible for overseeing a massive public trust, actively refused to investigate the glaring discrepancies between Doman's claims and the physical reality of their chairman. They prioritized the stability of their stock options over the basic human dignity of their founder. They allowed the fiction of the Iron Chairman to persist, providing the perfect corporate smokescreen for the domestic coup occurring behind the gates of Beverly Park. The empire he built on a foundation of absolute control and the ruthless elimination of independent thought had functioned flawlessly, successfully shielding the predators, extracting his lifeblood from any outside interference. By the fall of 2015, the takeover was seemingly impenetrable. Redstone had voluntarily funded the destruction of his own autonomy. He had spent his entire life crushing rivals, leveraging debt, and destroying competent executives to maintain his grip on power, only to surrender his literal life or death decisions to a companion simply because she provided the daily purchased validation that he was still a king. He had traded his empire for an audience of two. He was isolated, medicated, and legally bound to his captors. And this exact point of total victory is precisely where the architecture of the scheme begins to crack. The fatal flaw of relying on paid mercenaries is that their loyalty is tethered exclusively to the velocity of the cash flow. Hertzer and Holland had successfully eliminated all external threats. They had defeated the family. They had pacified the corporate board. They held the legal documents and the access to the checkbooks. The only remaining obstacle to their absolute unchecked acquisition of his entire fortune was each other. The greed that had united them in isolating the billionaire was about to mutate into a vicious internal war for supremacy, triggering a chain reaction of catastrophic legal blunders that would finally tear down the walls of the fortress and drag the grotesque reality of Sumner Redstone's bedroom into the unforgiving light of the federal court system. The alliance forged between Manuela Hertzer and Sidney Holland was never bound by loyalty or a shared vision for the future of Viacom. It was a tactical, highly lucrative non-aggression pact constructed entirely within the sterile, heavily guarded perimeter of the Beverly Park mansion. They had successfully operated as a dual monarchy, systematically pacifying the 92-year-old billionaire, neutralizing the corporate board in New York, and legally locking his family out of the estate. They held the healthcare proxy. They controlled the flow of sedatives, and they managed the specialized iPad that functioned as his only voice. They had effectively walled themselves inside a vault containing one of the largest personal fortunes in American history. However, the fundamental architecture of this scheme possessed a fatal structural flaw. When a system is built entirely on the ruthless, unchecked extraction of wealth, and all external threats have been eliminated, the predators inevitably turn their sights on each other. The greed that had united them in isolating Sumner Redstone was the exact mechanism that triggered an internal catastrophic civil war, rapidly dismantling the entire machine of secrecy from the inside out. By the summer of 2015, the volume of cash and assets flowing out of Redstone's personal accounts and into the possession of these two women reached a scale that defies standard financial comprehension. Court documents would later allege that the total extraction during this period amounted to approximately $150 million. This was not corporate compensation. This was personal wealth transferred in the form of direct cash wires, designer clothing allowances, and massive real estate acquisitions. The women were effectively operating a shadow corporation within his bedroom, dividing the spoils of his biological decline. They utilized his checkbook to purchase sprawling mansions in Los Angeles, demanding that he fund their lavish, independent lifestyles while he remained physically tethered to a feeding pump and a suction machine. The supreme contradiction of this era exposes the devastating reality of Redstone's core psychological weakness. He was a man who had spent half a century utilizing his immense wealth to crush rivals, execute hostile takeovers, and enforce absolute dominance over the American media landscape. He fundamentally believed that money could purchase total control over human behavior. Yet, the $75 million he funneled to Sidney Holland could not purchase basic exclusivity. In the late summer of 2015, the illusion of his purchased masculinity suffered a catastrophic, humiliating breach. It was discovered that Holland, while residing in his compound and systematically draining his accounts, was allegedly conducting a secret romantic affair with an actor named George Santopietro. This revelation was not a mere domestic scandal. It was a targeted strike against the central delusion keeping Redstone alive. He had alienated his daughter, purged his executives, and surrendered his medical autonomy specifically to maintain the manufactured reality that he was still a vibrant, highly desired titan. The discovery of the affair proved that his transaction had failed. He had bought a sycophant, not a partner, and he was being publicly cuckolded by the very woman he was financing. The man who had famously fired the visionary CEO of MTV over a perceived corporate slight was now forced to confront the reality that he was the victim of a spectacularly expensive, highly intimate grift. Manuela Herzer immediately recognized the strategic value of Holland's indiscretion and weaponized it with ruthless efficiency. She did not attempt to mediate the situation or protect Redstone from the emotional fallout. She utilized the affair as the ultimate leverage to eliminate her final rival. Herzer orchestrated a brutal, immediate purge. In early September 2015, Sidney Holland was banished from the Beverly Park compound. The security guards, paid by Redstone, but taken operational cues from Herzer, were instructed to block Holland from ever returning. The dual monarchy was dissolved. Herzer had successfully executed a domestic hostile takeover, consolidating absolute singular control over the billionaire, his estate, and the highly critical advance health care directive. She was now the sole apex predator in the mansion. But this aggressive consolidation of power triggered a massive, unforeseen external consequence. Herzer and Holland had operated under the assumption that the Beverly Park Fortress was immune to outside scrutiny, protected by the dense web of non-disclosure agreements and the complicity of the Viacom board. They failed to account for the cold bureaucratic arithmetic of the federal government. The Internal Revenue Service does not care about Hollywood NDAs or corporate maneuvering. It cares strictly about the ledger. And the ledger revealed massive unauthorized wealth transfers to two individuals who were neither legal spouses nor dependents, triggering a devastating financial audit. The financial fallout was immediate and indeed devastating. Under federal tax law, gifts of this magnitude trigger astronomical tax liabilities for the individual writing the check. The IRS assessed Redstone with a gift tax debt estimated at roughly $90 million. This sudden massive liability exposed the fragile, hollow reality of his financial situation. While his net worth was theoretically valued at $5 billion, that wealth was almost entirely illiquid, locked up in the tightly controlled dual-class voting shares of Viacom and CBS stock. His actual cash reserves had been thoroughly gutted by the relentless extraction campaign orchestrated by the women. The architect of the modern media conglomerate, the man who had leveraged junk bonds to swallow Paramount Pictures, was suddenly facing a severe liquidity crisis simply because he had been manipulated into giving away his cash. He was completely cash poor. To satisfy the demands of the federal government, Redstone was forced to take humiliating financial measures. He had to explore selling off portions of his fiercely guarded stock or taking out massive, high-interest personal loans to pay the taxes on the money he had been manipulated into handing over to his abusers. The very wealth he had hoarded to protect himself from the world had been transformed into a weapon pointed directly at his own survival, turning him into a dependent debtor to the state. This financial crisis fundamentally altered the atmosphere inside the mansion. The cash flow, which had previously been an unchecked torrent, suddenly encountered severe friction. The estate lawyers and financial managers, facing the terrifying reality of a $90 million tax bomb, could no longer blindly process the exorbitant wire transfers. Herzer, having eliminated her rival, found herself attempting to extract wealth from an increasingly dry well. Her absolute control over his medical care remained intact, but her access to his liquid capital was suddenly being challenged by the sheer mathematical reality of his depleted bank accounts. Greed, operating in a vacuum of accountability, inevitably leads to a fatal overreach. Herzer, believing her position was unassailable because she held the healthcare proxy, pushed too hard. She intensified her demands, allegedly becoming increasingly hostile and volatile as the financial friction increased. The exact mechanics of the internal uprising remained shielded by layers of subsequent litigation, but the psychological breaking point was reached in early October 2015. Sumner Redstone, surviving in a heavily sedated haze, tethered to a feeding pump and requiring constant suctioning, experienced a sudden, violent shift in his immediate environment. Perhaps the financial reality of the IRS audit managed to penetrate his isolation. Perhaps the remaining nursing staff, witnessing Herzer's escalating volatility and realizing the cash was drying up, decided to align themselves with the estate lawyers. Or perhaps the sheer relentless cruelty of the isolation finally triggered the latent dormant aggression that had once built an empire. Whatever the catalyst, The legal machinery that Herzer had used to banish Holland was suddenly turned against her. On October 12, 2015, the 3-button iPad, the device Herzer had allegedly used to manipulate his consent, was utilized to execute her own downfall. Through a series of interactions overseen by his estate attorneys, Redstone reportedly hit the expletive button when Herzer's name was mentioned. He pointed a trembling finger at documents drafted to immediately revoke her status as his healthcare proxy. The legal paperwork, identical in its clinical brutality to the documents he had once used to fire executives, was executed in his bedroom. Manuela Herzer was stripped of her authority, removed from the trust, and explicitly written out of his will. The security guards escorted her off the Beverly Park property, locking the iron gates behind her. For a brief moment, it appeared the crisis had been resolved internally. The predators had been expelled. The financial bleeding was halted. Redstone's lawyers immediately moved to reinstate his daughter, Sherry Redstone, establishing a secure, familial perimeter around his medical care. The fortress had survived, albeit severely damaged and financially drained. However, Herzer did not walk away quietly. She had grown accustomed to the absolute power and the limitless wealth of the Beverly Park lifestyle. Her ego, inflated by years of manipulating a billionaire, could not process the sudden, humiliating expulsion. Instead of taking the tens of millions of dollars she had already secured and retreating into obscurity, she made a catastrophic, retaliatory miscalculation. She decided to launch a direct, public assault against the Redstone estate. To prove her case, she would be forced to submit highly detailed, excruciatingly intimate medical records, and sworn testimonies detailing the exact horrific reality of his daily existence. The woman who had spent years enforcing the non-disclosure agreements and operating the machinery of his silence was about to tear the roof off the mansion, filing a legal petition that would brand the 92-year-old billionaire as a living ghost and permanently shatter the illusion that he possessed the mental competence to run a $40 billion empire. The retaliatory strike launched by Manuela Herzer in late November 2015 fundamentally altered the trajectory of American corporate history. When she filed her 70-page legal petition in Los Angeles Superior Court, she did not merely seek reinstatement as Sumner Redstone's healthcare proxy. She executed a scorched earth campaign designed to completely obliterate the carefully curated mythology of the Viacom boardroom. For nearly a decade, a massive apparatus of highly paid executives, corporate public relations teams, and aggressive lawyer had maintained the fiction that the 92-year-old billionaire was a fully engaged, commanding presence. Herzer's lawsuit acted as a detonator, blowing the doors off the Beverly Park mansion and dragging the horrific clinical reality of his daily existence into the unforgiving light of the public record. She alleged, under penalty of perjury, that the chairman of a $40 billion media empire was entirely devoid of mental capacity. She branded him a living ghost. The specific details contained within the court filings were devastating in their clinical precision. The public, and more importantly, the institutional shareholders of Viacom and CBS, were suddenly confronted with sworn declarations describing a man who was incapable of following a simple storyline on television. The lawsuit detailed a patient who suffered from uncontrollable weeping spells, a man who required constant mechanical intervention simply to clear the saliva pooling in his throat. Herzer's legal team submitted documentation alleging that Redstone possessed the cognitive function of a severely impaired child, operating in a heavily sedated haze, completely unmoored from the complex financial realities of the companies he technically controlled. She argued that his decision to expel her from his home and revoke her authority was not an act of sudden clarity, but rather the result of intense manipulation by his estate lawyers and his estranged daughter, Sherry. This legal maneuver presented an astonishing paradox. The woman who had spent the previous 5 years utilizing severe non-disclosure agreements to enforce a perimeter of absolute silence around the billionaire was now utilizing the judicial system to broadcast his severe biological decay to the entire world. She was essentially arguing that because she had intimately managed his profound vulnerability, she alone possessed the legal right to continue exploiting it. The lawsuit forced the appointment of an independent geriatric IC psychiatrist, Dr. Stephen Reed, to conduct a formal evaluation of Redstone's mental competence. The subsequent medical reports, which inevitably leaked to the press, confirmed the catastrophic extent of his physical and neurological decline. The illusion was dead. The man who had famously declared to Wall Street that he would never die was now officially documented as a deeply impaired, highly vulnerable dependent. Hertzer's lawsuit acted as a detonator. By officially branding the 92-year-old billionaire a living ghost, she inadvertently shattered the massive corporate cover-up maintained by Viacom's board in New York. Institutional investors panicked. The illusion was dead. The man who had famously declared to Wall Street that he would never die was now officially documented as a deeply impaired dependent. This explosive exposure forced the one scenario Redstone and his captors had fought to prevent: the return of his estranged daughter. Stepping into the chaos, Sherry Redstone executed a decisive, ruthless maneuver that mirrored her father's tactics in his prime. She purged the complicit executives, seized control of the corporate trusts, and forced the board into submission. With the empire secured, she turned her sights back to the Beverly Park mansion, launching a massive civil lawsuit against Hertzer and Holland for elder abuse to demand the return of the extracted millions. The dark, highly lucrative era of the harem was forcefully terminated. With the corporate governance stabilized and the immediate threat of Hertzer's probate lawsuit temporarily managed through legal maneuvering, the Redstone family pivoted from defense to a brutal forensic offense. They recognized that removing the predators from the mansion was insufficient. They required total accountability for the years of exploitation. In 2016, the Redstone estate filed a massive civil lawsuit against both Manuela Hertzer and Sidney Holland, charging them with elder abuse, fraud, and the intentional infliction of emotional distress. The objective was explicitly clear. The estate demanded the return of the $150 million that had been systematically drained from his accounts. This elder abuse lawsuit represents the definitive historical ledger of the operation. The discovery process pierced the final veils of secrecy, producing financial records, internal emails, and sworn depositions from the mansion staff that detailed the exact mechanics of the grift. The court filings revealed that the women had essentially utilized Redstone's bank accounts as an unlimited, unregulated ATM. Holland was accused of directing millions of dollars to her secret lover, George Santopietro, while simultaneously charging massive sums to Redstone's credit cards for luxury clothing, private jet travel, and high-end jewelry. Hertzer was accused of aggressively manipulating the nursing staff, threatening to fire any medical professional who attempted to record Redstone's vital signs accurately or report the heavy administration of sedatives. The evidence exposed a terrifying, highly sophisticated spy network operating entirely within the walls of the Beverly Park estate. Former nurses testified that the women had installed hidden recording devices in Redstone's bedroom and monitored the internal phone lines to intercept any communication from the family or independent medical advisors. The staff was subjected to an environment of constant surveillance and extreme intimidation. Nurses were reportedly forced to communicate with each other using untraceable burner phones, terrified of triggering the wrath of the gatekeepers. The mansion had not merely been a hospital, it had been a highly militarized zone of extraction where the primary objective was keeping the billionaire alive just long enough to process the next massive wire transfer. The sheer audacity of the financial demands made by the women during this period borders on the surreal. According to He Estate's filings, even as Redstone lay incapacitated, struggling to breathe, the women actively conspired to modify his will to grant themselves the rights to his heavily fortified Beverly Park mansion, the very property where he was being held captive. They sought to inherit the vault itself. They demanded specialized allowances for the maintenance of their own massive estates, which they had purchased using his money. The lawsuit methodically deconstructed the narrative of loving companionship, replacing it with a cold, terrifying portrait of systemic, calculated elder abuse executed on an unprecedented financial scale. The architect of mass communication, who spent half a century acquiring the most powerful global broadcast mechanisms, was ultimately weaponized by the very people extracting his wealth. He built an empire of words, but his definitive final battle hinged entirely on his profound silence. The protracted legal warfare continued to grind through the court systems for years. The elder abuse lawsuit filed by the estate against Herzer and Holland triggered vicious counterclaims and aggressive discovery battles. In 2019, recognizing the impossibility of defending the sheer volume of extracted wealth against the overwhelming medical evidence of Redstone's incapacitation, the legal lines finally broke. Manuela Herzer agreed to a settlement. To end the litigation, she was legally compelled to repay $3.25 million to the Redstone estate. Sydney Holland eventually reached her own confidential settlement with the family. The money, while a fraction of the total $150 million extracted, represented a formal legal acknowledgement of the grift. The women were permanently barred from his presence, and the dark, highly lucrative era of the Beverly Park harem was officially terminated. The conclusion of the lawsuits brought a heavy, sterile silence back to the mansion. The spy networks were dismantled. The burner phone, as were discarded. The flow of Ativan was strictly regulated by independent, highly vetted medical professionals. Sherry Redstone, having survived decades of public humiliation and a vicious corporate civil war, successfully secured the perimeter. She assumed operational control of national amusements, moving swiftly to repair the damage inflicted upon Viacom and CBS by years of paralyzed, sycophantic leadership. She eventually engineered the remerger of the two companies, creating Viacom-CBS, later rebranded as Paramount Global. She had saved the empire, but she could not reverse the biological reality of its founder. Sumner Redstone remained in his heavily fortified room, surrounded by specialized medical equipment, living out his final days in profound isolation. The predators were gone, the corporate crisis was resolved, but the devastating physical toll of his lifelong refusal to accept his own humanity remained permanently etched into his failing frame. The battle was over. leaving only the grim, inevitable wait for the biology he had fought so hard to defeat to finally claim its victory. By 2020, the chaotic theater of the Beverly Park mansion had been completely dismantled. The predators were gone, and Sherry Redstone had successfully secured the perimeter, repairing the fractured Viacom CBS empire. Yet the architect of that empire remained trapped in his fortified room, stripped of his power, his voice, and his illusions. On August 11th, the machinery was finally turned off. While sanitized corporate press releases praised his unparalleled vision, the global markets viewed his passing as the termination of a prolonged, grotesque hostage situation. His ultimate legacy was not the sprawling media monolith he built, but the devastating proof that absolute power cannot bribe the biological clock. In his desperate war against mortality, he merely built an incredibly expensive cage, guaranteeing that his final years were defined entirely by the terrifying isolation of his own design.